May 1945, the machinery of a state that had disciplined millions ground to a halt. In cities reduced to rubble, in emptied party offices, and in the flecks of official paperwork scattered across town halls and police stations, another question took shape. What would happen to the people who had run that machinery? Not only the architects and henchmen at the very top, but the clerks, the teachers, the mid-level administrators, the men in uniform who had kept the train schedules, the removal lists, and the registry books moving. The answer, as the occupation authorities and the courts would find out, was not a single verdict. It was a patchwork of arrests, trials, administrative measures, escapes, pragmatic reuses, and ultimately uneasy reintegration. The immediate weeks after Germany's surrender were chaos framed by order. Allied soldiers patrolled streets still littered with posters and swastikas. Offices stood abandoned. Files were half burned or left in desks. In some towns, citizens hauled party membership records into the open and burned them as acts of catharsis. In others, the same documents were turned over to occupation officials and used as the first evidence in the slow business of sorting guilt from complicity, zeal from survival. Occupation policy varied by zone, and that variation mattered. In the Soviet-occupied East, the approach was uncompromising. Large numbers of officials were detained, party machinery was dismantled, and political re-education campaigns began almost immediately. The Western zones, administered by the United States, Britain, and France, combined a mix of military justice, administrative screening, and later civilian courts. Initially, the priority for all Allied administrations was obvious: neutralize any remaining capacity for organized violence, identify war criminals, and secure documentation. The practical problem, however, was scale. The Nazi Party had grown into a mass organization. There were, broadly, indefinite numbers of members and a far larger web of people who had worked within or alongside the regime. Arresting and detaining everyone was impossible. Senior leaders, those whose names had been synonymous with policy and atrocity, were the first and most public targets. High-profile arrests in the capture of top officials were both symbolic and practical. They allowed Allied prosecutors to demonstrate that there would be legal consequences and to gather testimony and documents indicating how decisions had been made at the highest levels. But the reality on the ground was that the great majority of those associated with the regime fell into a different category: rank-and-file party members, local administrators, police officers, and professionals whose degree of ideological commitment and criminal responsibility varied widely. Detention facilities had to be improvised and repurposed. Former military barracks, prisons, and even concentration camps were used to hold suspects and to house displaced populations. Many detainees were held while occupation authorities conducted initial screenings. Some were held for months or years pending investigation. Others were released after cursory checks when manpower needs, or a lack of incriminating evidence, made prolonged detention impractical. The occupation files that survive from that period show an administrative system stretched thin. Lists of names, affidavits, and sometimes the crude shorthand judgments of exhausted officials trying to make sense of a ruined bureaucracy. International justice emerged as a defining response to the most notorious crimes. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, convened in late 1945, put a small number of top leaders on trial for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The tribunal's significance was not only its condemnation of certain individuals, it established legal principles about responsibility, conspiracy, and the culpability of state leaders. Yet the tribunal also demonstrated the limits of international law as it was practiced in that moment. The defendants represented only a sliver of those responsible for the Nazi system. The trials produced important convictions and sentences, and they recorded in exhaustive forensic detail how policies of persecution had been carried out. But by design and by capacity, Nuremberg could not prosecute the millions who had implemented and sustained the regime in smaller, decentralized ways. National trials followed, conducted by German courts, by the judicial systems of countries that had been occupied, and by military tribunals across the Allied zones. These courts pursued a broader range of perpetrators than the International Tribunal. In Poland, in France, in the Soviet Union, and in German courts themselves, prosecutions addressed crimes that had occurred locally. Yet the reach of these efforts remained limited by resources and political shifts. Many mid-level perpetrators, those who had directly participated in atrocities or who had facilitated repression at regional levels, were tried, but many others escaped prosecution altogether or received relatively light sentences compared to the enormity of their actions. Alongside tribunals and prosecutions, occupation authorities implemented administrative programs to dismantle the social and political underpinnings of Nazism. Denazification became the English-language shorthand for a complex set of policies, legal, bureaucratic, and often ad hoc, aimed at removing those who had been committed Nazis from positions of influence. In the Western zones, denazification took shape through questionnaires, local review boards, and what became known in the German-language discourse as Spruchkammern, tribunals that classified individuals into categories ranging from major offenders to exonerated persons. The categories attempted to distinguish between active perpetrators and nominal members, between ideological leaders and those who had joined for career reasons or social pressure. The process was deeply bureaucratic and, in practice, inconsistent. Questionnaires asked about party membership, involvement in Nazi organizations, and wartime activities, but they were vulnerable to false denials, administrative overload, and local partisan pressures. The Spruchkammern were staffed by a mix of occupation-appointed officials and later by Germans themselves. Their decisions sometimes reflected the exigencies of rebuilding rather than a thorough moral accounting. In many cases, the need to restore civil administration, schools, and industry created a powerful incentive to reintegrate experienced personnel quickly. A municipal treasurer who had been a nominal party member might be allowed to return to work because there was no one else to manage finances in a devastated town. Consequences varied. Some individuals lost pensions, were barred from certain professions, or had property confiscated. Others were required to perform public statements of contrition or undertake re-education measures. Even here, however, scale and politics intervened. By the late 1940s, with the Cold War beginning to harden, denazification programs in the Western zones were increasingly criticized as impractical and politically destabilizing. The urgency of economic recovery and the priority of forming a bulwark against Soviet influence often trumped the thorough enforcement of penalties. In some places, denazification procedures were expedited, downgraded, or even abandoned. Administrators and employers pressed for the fastest route to stability. At the same time, some perpetrators used clandestine routes to leave Europe entirely. Escape and evasion, sometimes aided, sometimes improvised, became a notable chapter in the post-war story. Networks that facilitated transit through southern Germany and Austria, that coordinated paperwork in the chaos at ports and border crossings, and that found ways to place fugitive former officials in countries across the Atlantic, played a role in enabling some to move far from the reach of European courts. Routes often ran through Italy and Spain, and then onward to Latin America. Argentina, among other countries, became a destination for several émigrés. The historical record shows both organized assistance in some cases and individual improvisation in others. Controversial questions remain about the extent to which certain institutions or officials knowingly assisted fugitives. These are matters historians continue to probe, distinguishing between documented corridors of escape and the more speculative claims of vast conspiracy networks. Some of the most notorious figures who had fled were eventually located and brought to trial, providing highly public moments of belated justice. The Israeli capture and subsequent trial of Adolf Eichmann in the early 1960s stands as the most prominent example. Abducted from Argentina in 1960, Eichmann was tried in Jerusalem in 1961 and executed in 1962. His trial highlighted both the reach of post-war memory and the limits of formal legalism decades after crimes had been committed. Yet, for every high-profile capture, there were many less publicized cases that never resulted in prosecution. Parallel to legal and clandestine developments, a different dynamic was unfolding: the pragmatic reuse of knowledge and personnel in the name of emerging geopolitical priorities. Western intelligence agencies and scientific establishments, eyeing the strategic landscape of the Cold War, sometimes recruited former German specialists, engineers, technicians, and even intelligence or military officers whose expertise was valuable to the United States and its allies. Programs that brought scientists and technical experts to the U.S. and Britain have been well documented and remain ethically fraught in retrospect. The argument advanced by proponents of such programs was utilitarian. The technical and scientific skills that had been developed during the war were critical for national security and technological competition. Critics saw, rightly, a moral compromise. Expertise obtained under or serving a criminal regime was being repurposed by the victorious powers, creating a tension between accountability and strategic necessity. The Soviet zone followed different logic. The Soviets were generally less inclined to rehabilitate former officials. They extracted reparations, dismantled industrial facilities, and sometimes conscripted German specialists for reconstruction projects under strict supervision. Political purges and re-education campaigns also aimed to remold local political life. Where the Western zones leaned toward reconstruction and selective reintegration, the Soviet zone emphasized political transformation and the removal of what it called fascist elements, again with considerable variation in practice. As the 1950s progressed and the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, and the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, found their feet as separate states, the question of reintegration became central to social and political life. In West Germany, the politics of re-establishing civilian governance and the need for experienced administrators meant that many former party members returned to work in civil service, industry, education, and business. Some re-entered politics, others took lower-profile roles in local administration. This reconstruction of ordinary life did not imply forgiveness or erasure of responsibility. Public debate, victim testimony, and survivor accounts continued to press governments and societies to reckon with the past, but the balance between rebuilding a functioning state and pursuing every instance of legal accountability tilted toward the former in many places. The later decades brought renewed energies of inquiry and prosecution. From the 1960s onward, a new wave of trials, investigations, and public examinations, driven by changing political climates, survivor testimony, and the work of journalists and historians, reopened questions that had been left unresolved in the immediate post-war years. National courts in Germany and elsewhere pursued cases that had been overlooked. Archives were combed for documents that could substantiate prosecutions, and public discourse shifted to demand a fuller confrontation with the mechanisms of complicity. The resulting trials and investigations exposed previously hidden networks of administration and showed that the reach of responsibility extended beyond the most notorious names. Memory institutions, museums, memorials, archives began to take shape as well. Places that had been sites of atrocity were reimagined, in some cases transformed into memorials and education centers. Scholarly work, legal scholarship, and public history projects contributed to a longer-term reckoning that went beyond criminal prosecutions to ask how societies teach and remember wartime crimes. The shaping of public memory was itself contested. Who would be acknowledged as victims, what narratives would dominate school curricula, and how would the roles of ordinary citizens be depicted? These debates showed that justice after mass atrocity is not only a matter of courts and prisons, but also of public narrative and institutional commitment. Throughout this story runs a central paradox. A society that insisted upon the severity of Nazi crimes also had to rebuild itself using people and structures that were, in many cases, tainted by association. Administrators who had kept municipal services running during the Third Reich were sometimes indispensable to post-war recovery. Industrial managers who had collaborated with the regime's war economy were later needed to revive factories and jobs. The choices made in this moral and practical terrain were seldom clean. Some were straightforward prosecutions, others were compromises judged necessary at the time and regretted later. Two emblematic cases help visualize these tensions. The prosecution at Nuremberg crystallized legal responsibility for state-level crimes and provided an archival record of bureaucratic decision-making that remains foundational for international law. Decades later, the capture and trial of Eichmann forced publics to confront how a derivative bureaucrat could be central to systems of mass murder, and how easy it might be for such actors to vanish into the anonymity of exile.
Between these bookends lay millions of ambiguous lives. Party members who burned their cards and blended into post-war anonymity, mid-level officials who took menial jobs in the rebuilt economy, policemen who were retrained under new political orders, and industrialists who resumed careers while the full moral weight of their wartime activities remained debated. When we step back, the picture that emerges resists tidy moral closure. Some perpetrators were tried and condemned, some escaped and lived under assumed identities. Many ordinary party members were reintegrated, others were placed under restrictions or social stigma. The Cold War reshaped priorities, and reconstruction imperatives often outweighed punitive zeal. The process of denazification produced both meaningful accountability and bureaucratic theater. It exposed the difficulty of translating moral outrage into administrable law at scale. Later trials and historical inquiry corrected, to some extent, early omissions, but they could not undo compromises made during Reconstruction. What, then, is the lesson of these decades? It is not that justice failed entirely, nor that it was complete. It is that large-scale crimes pose an immense challenge to legal systems, societies, and moral imagination. The post-war settlement shows how practical needs, geopolitical strategy, and the limits of legal mechanisms intersect to shape outcomes. It also teaches that memory and documentation are crucial. Records, trials, survivor testimony, and scholarly work keep the past from being smoothed over in the rush to rebuild. Files and membership cards, what had been evidence, became both tool and burden as society sought to balance reconstruction with remembrance. The ultimate fate of many who had been part of the Nazi apparatus was not a single answer, but a range of outcomes determined by war's immediate logistics, subsequent politics, individual choices, and later historical reckoning. If the question, what became of them, admits no simple answer, it nevertheless compels an enduring responsibility to preserve the record, to continue legal and historical inquiry where possible, and to keep the moral lessons of that era present in public life. If this exploration has raised questions for you, there's a deeper video linked that examines the Nuremberg trials in greater detail. Check it out after this one. History does not allow us to live back through the past. It does allow us to learn from the traces left behind. The story of Nazi Party members after the war is a study in scale, in moral compromise, and in the long work of remembrance. Some were held to account, more returned to ordinary life, some slipped away entirely. The record is messy, and that messiness is itself instructive. Justice after mass atrocity is rarely absolute, and the choices a society makes in its aftermath leave legacies for generations. If we are to honor victims and prevent repetition, the commitment must be ongoing, through courts, through education, through memorialization. If you found this examination useful, subscribe and watch our related episode on what happened to German naval assets after the war for another perspective on how wartime legacies were managed.